Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The post-Soviet frozen conflict known as Nagorno-Karabakh is now very hot. We tell you what you need to know. And is America in 2020 acting out similar events that witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest, George Samueli. He is an author and a YouTuber at The Gaggle. And here in Moscow, we have Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst and editor at InnoSME Internet Media Project. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to George in Budapest. The conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh has flared up again. Those that have us been watching the post-Soviet space have gotten used to this here. Now, after over 7 days of the conflict reigniting, again, George, it's some kind of stalemate. Put it into context. Why is this conflict important to follow? Go ahead, George.
Well, you have to go back to the earliest days of the Bolshevik Revolution and to the decisions of Joseph Stalin, who was the Bolsheviks' point man on nationalities. He was the nationalities Tsar among the Bolsheviks. And he decided that this region of Nagorno-Karabakh should be a part of Azerbaijan, should be within the territory of Azerbaijan.
And its ethnic makeup.
Exactly, it's ethnically Armenian. The Armenians were very unhappy about this because the Armenians said that this should be a part of Armenia, but he decided it should be a part of Azerbaijan, in large part because the Bolsheviks were seeking to appeal to the Muslims of Asia and also the Muslims of what became the USSR, and in particular to Turkey. And at that time, the nascent Bolshevik regime was making great efforts to keep Turkey happy. So that's when it was set up. Now, of course, it didn't really matter so much within the USSR because everybody just did as they were told by the leadership in Moscow. But when the Soviet Union broke up in that completely chaotic, appalling way, then of course these nationalities issues flared up because it was one thing to be for the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh to be part of Azerbaijan, which was within the Soviet Union. It's quite another thing to be part of Azerbaijan, which is now an independent state. Okay. So this has been really going on since the breakup of the Soviet Union.
And one of the things that makes it different than what we saw from the original conflict coming out of the end of the Soviet Union was in the late 80s, early 90s. Dima, I want to address this to you. But in this case, both countries are relatively well armed now, even though Azerbaijan has significantly more wealth because of oil. And Russia supplies the arms to both countries, more or less here. But the difference in this case, this time around, is it's becoming much more internationalized. Turkey is playing a major role here. And a lot of people are very critical of Turkey's role here. Israel is involved. Others want to pull in Iran. This is the internationalization of it. If it weren't internationalized, it would be a repeat we've seen a number of times. This is what it makes it different this time. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, you are absolutely right. I think a lot of countries are just behaving irresponsibly in relation to this conflict. I would just suggest you compare the statements of President Erdogan and the statements of the Kremlin. Erdogan just openly says, I quote, "We'll support everything Azerbaijan thinks it makes sense to do for its security." I mean, what kind of partial attitude is that? Yeah. So that is certainly irresponsible on the side of Turkey. But why did it become possible? Turkey has not behaved so irresponsibly during the last conflict, which ended in 1994, basically with the victory of Armenia. Well, I think the reason is basically what happened in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years. Just let me remind you, when Turkey attacked Syria in 2011, 2012, openly, everyone reported, the Western press reported that Turkey supported, the terrorist groups that entered Syria from the north. It was not a secret. NATO was on the side of Turkey. Let me remind you that when Syria downed a Turkish fighter plane over its territory in the beginning of the war, quite legally, because the Turkish fighter plane was on in the Syrian airspace, NATO even had a crisis meeting. They were deciding what to do in order to support Turkey. Ironically, just a few years later, in 2019, when Turkey moved against the American allies in the north of Syria against the Kurds, the attitude of NATO was completely different. They started talking about Erdogan trespassing the borders of a sovereign state of Syria, which they didn't care about just a few years ago, right? So it was a complete change of attitude. Unfortunately, Erdogan kind of, got the tune of it. So if you do things that the West does not object to, you are free to act as you want, basically. In this situation, he decided that it was just about time to give support to Azerbaijan, and that encouraged Azerbaijan to act as it did.
It's one of the things that we've discussed, all three of us have discussed previously, is that why does Turkey do it? Is because it can do it here. And that's a very dangerous foreign policy, okay, because you're not thinking about the consequences of it. George, there are media reports that through Turkish channels that you have fighters from Syria and Libya, and the caliber of them, these are militants, jihadists by one description or another. They're being transported into this conflict, into Nagorno-Karabakh. That is a very dangerous step here. And considering what Dima just said about reaction to Turkey, we have the French President Macron speaking very, very clearly that this is a very dangerous development, according to reports. George.
Yes. The reports are certainly credible. I don't know to what extent they've been confirmed, but there's a widely accessible reports. And it's certainly consistent with everything else that Erdogan has done. I mean, if we remember, initially there were these jihadi terrorists who were transferred from Libya to Syria in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of Gaddafi. And then recently, Turkey has transferred these jihadis from Syria to Libya. So therefore, it would be perfectly plausible for Erdogan now to be transferring jihadi fighters from Syria into Azerbaijan. It's as you say, why is Erdogan doing this? Yeah, because he can. He figures that if he creates enough trouble, and he inflicts heavy defeats on the Armenians, then Russia and the rest of the Minsk group will have to accept realities on the ground. The Armenians will have to give up some territory within Azerbaijan, so the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh will be reduced, and then Erdogan will hail this as a great victory, yet another triumph of his foreign policy.
But also that would signal a defeat for Russian foreign policy. And that's
absolutely. That's clearly what he's gambling on. Yeah.
People have talked about Erdogan and this neo-Ottomanism and things like that. I mean, there's a literature on it, and maybe it's just a pipe dream too. But one thing is undeniable in all of this. This is a major irritant for Russia, because Russia trades with both these countries. I mean, even to the point with the kind of military hardware with planes, for example, both governments need permission from Russia to actually use them in military action here. I mean, this is a real annoyance for the Kremlin here. And maybe that's the whole point. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, I would say that both sides, of course, have arguments in their favor. And Azerbaijan has some arguments too, because...
Well, Dima, let's be clear. Nagorno-Karabakh officially, legally, under international law, is part of Azerbaijan.
Absolutely. And when the war ended in 1994, as I said, it was Armenia's victory. And most of the refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh were ethnic Azerbaijanis. Not only is Nagorno-Karabakh under Armenian control, but also 7 adjacent districts of Azerbaijan proper are under Armenian control. So I think what we should all pray for is that Baku just wants to, get back 1 or 2 of these areas which are not populated almost by anyone right now. That would be, I think, the best outcome, because it would be, the formula security in return for territories in action. But unfortunately, there is a high risk it's not going to happen, because both sides are raising the stakes. The latest reports are that Armenian missiles, some Armenian artillery have targeted Ganja, which is the second largest city in Azerbaijan. That just, kind of raises the stakes dramatically in this situation. So both sides have arguments in their favor, and the Russian attitude is very simple: just stop fighting, try to resolve it by peaceful means, because if there are refugees, of course, a lot of them will go to Russia. And that's the most, I think, rational attitude to this conflict, because if we go back to history, both sides will find dozens of arguments in their favor. But you are absolutely right that it's an irritant for Russia. I think it's not just an irritant, it's a very bad situation for all of the international community. And the West is also in a precarious situation here, because initially in the late 80s, the Russian liberals, or Soviet liberals at the time, and the West basically supported the Armenian side. But when Azerbaijan joined the GUAM, this anti-Russian coalition of post-Soviet states, the attitudes in the West suddenly changed. And there was more and more sympathy for Azerbaijan. So basically, I think there's only one solution: is just to stop fighting and restart the formula territories in return for security, because both sides have destructive weapons.
It's very interesting is that in the late 80s and early 90s, Iran could have played a very important mediating role, but they were shut out by the West. Again, a regional player, a very important and powerful one, was shut out of a process that could have had a peace process internationalized, instead of having someone like Erdogan trying to flare up the conflict. We'll end on this point, George. I think we'll know it's all over when Erdogan is summoned to Sochi.
I think it could well be. But I think at some point Russia would have to intervene in a more decisive fashion. Russia cannot afford to be marginalized in this process. So if Erdogan is able to hail this as a great victory, Russia is the great power in the region. Russia mediated the end of the previous conflict. It cannot afford to look weak and ineffective.
Okay. On that note there, we're going to go to a short break, and after a short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real new state with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let's go to Dima. Let's switch gears a little bit here. I came across an absolutely fascinating article in the American Conservative by a writer, Helen Andrews, and her article is 2020 is tumbling towards 1917. Subtitle, we think we're safe from revolution. We're wrong. It's already in the works. What do you think about the comparison of what's happening in the U.S. politically in this very tumultuous year, and reflection about what happened historically in 1917 in the Russian Empire that would soon come to an end? Dima.
Well, it's rare that you read such things in the American media, because it's an anathema for the American ultra-liberals to compare modern United States to the early Soviet Union. They abhor all comparisons to Stalinism or to Leninism. But in fact, for me, due to my historical knowledge of Russia and due to the observations that I make of the American public political life right now, the parallels are obvious. They're not just obvious, they're striking. I think the reason for the parallels is that we have basically two totalitarianisms here, which have a lot of things in common. Trump is unable to discern this third totalitarianism, the third after Nazism and communism, which is now basically ruling the United States, instead of him, an elected president. This is the ideology of ultraliberalism that is ruling the United States. And Trump cannot recognize it, so he just traces it back to, the Soviet Bolsheviks and the Marxism. There are parallels, but these are different ideologies. Parallels are in radicalism, The technology is the same. You find a certain group of individuals, a social group, you declare them to have been oppressed historically. Now you claim to have the right to represent this formerly oppressed minority and to act on their behalf. In the case of Russia, it was the proletariat.
I'm going to read between the lines there. So the Bolsheviks and the Black Lives Matter have some kind of historical relation.
Absolutely. And it's not just Helen Andrews that drew attention to this, but also Peter Savodnik in The Tablet, which is an American magazine on religious affairs. He published a fascinating article called Woke America is a Russian Novel. He published it in July in The Tablet, and let me just quote it. He talks about Yevgeny Bazarov, a character of Turgenev's novel, written in the mid-19th century. Bazarov is an early Bolshevik, so to speak, a nihilist. This is when the word nihilism became popular in Russia and later on in the whole world. So let me just quote Peter Savodnik. One wonders if Bazarov is that different from today's protesters and statue toppers, the 20-somethings sowing discord in our newsrooms, the cancel culturists, the Überwoke, the sociopaths who police our social media feeds. Well, this is exactly true, because the problem with Bolshevism is that it's less of an ideology, it's less the communism, it's a technology of coming to power.
Yeah,
you shut down all of your opponents. You declare everyone who disagrees an enemy. You declare everyone who disagrees a reactionary. And just see how it worked in the Wall Street Journal, for example, where you have the opinion page fighting the newsroom, The opinion page are old-style liberals. They're like the constitutional Democrats who toppled the Tsar in February 1917. They hoped to create a new liberal Russia, and they failed. And the newsroom are the Bolsheviks, who actually they are already sidelining old-style American liberals in the same way Bolsheviks sidelined constitutional Democrats in Russia in 1917.
The reason why this can happen, George, the reason why this can happen, because there's a crisis of legitimacy. Okay, that is the ultimate parallel of the Bolsheviks in 1917 or France in 1789. I mean, it's always about the lack of legitimacy, and you have people within the power structures that are fueling on this illegitimacy. Okay, they are actually destroying the system themselves. This is not a bottom-up thing. This is a top-down thing again, George.
That's right. That's right. So Dima mentioned Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. I would cite another great Russian novel, which is perhaps even more apt, which is Dostoevsky's The Possessed. Because Dostoevsky was convinced that the nihilists, or some of them were nihilists, some of them were kind of extreme socialists, were really the product of the liberals of the earlier generation. The liberals of the earlier generation had encouraged this nihilism, this destructiveness, and they had fostered this radical movement. But what was really stunning about that novel is the complete collapse of the order. The old order just collapsed like a house of cards. And so, Dostoevsky wrote this almost 40 years before 1917, and he foresaw exactly what happened. The entire Russian governmental structure, it had been there for hundreds of years, collapsed like a house of cards. And that's really and therefore there was a kind of a rot from within. And that's what you see in the United States. Because you see, where's Trump's real problem? It's within the intelligence, military, security establishment. They are openly defying the elected president. They're openly speaking of him with disdain as if he had no legitimacy. They criticize his moves when he went to that church in Lafayette Square. You had the military chiefs criticizing him. And Trump really didn't have the strength. He doesn't have the political strength to fire all these people, and therefore should this election turn out to be the chaos and that it looks like it's going to be, then we should expect some sort of an insurrection within the government, and Trump may not be able to do very much about it.
Yeah, I mean, the people in the political left in the United States Dima, are just absurdly ahistorical in their thinking. They think it can't happen to us. We can control this. We know how to manage it. No, they're missing history here. They're not students of history. Once you start stuff like this, it's almost impossible to control it, and they end up being the victims of it eventually. Okay, they're playing with fire here just because they hate the man in the Oval Office here. The implications of which are enormous. You can't control this kind of thing. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, you are absolutely right. And the problem is that, Bolsheviks first won in Russia, and then they used Bolshevism in their foreign policy. In the United States, it's vice versa. The ultra-liberals first used the tactic of demonization of political leaders outside the United States. They used it in Serbia, they used it against Ukraine, they used it against Russia, and now they're using it against their own president. So the technology of coming to power of the new Bolsheviks, or ultra-liberals as I call them, is very simple. They personify evil, They don't talk about historical process, they don't talk about economy or history, just there is an evil man, running this country. Remove him and life will be beautiful, Okay, they removed Gaddafi, and what do we have there? We have a civil war. It's a much more complicated society than just, one evil man controlling everything. And I agree completely with George, in The Possessed by Dostoevsky, please note that the main negative character, the revolutionary Peter Verhovensky, his father is an old-style liberal, and he is portrayed satirically in the beginning of the novel. So basically, Dostoevsky predicted that future Bolsheviks will come from westernizing liberals.
Okay.
They will stem from them,
But also, George, if you look we all know the techniques that the Bolsheviks used to come to power, and they understood how power worked. I give them that. The rest of it, the ideology, no, but they understood that, all right? But if you're a student of history and you're a student of the Bolsheviks, and it makes me think of Stephen Cohen, who just recently passed away, wrote the seminal book, I think, on the Bolsheviks, and that was on Bukharin. What happened to him? He was a victim of a huge purge that culminated in 1937. And the same kind of purge will come to these people, okay? Because they have let this very toxic, and I called it ideological possession. They're possessed people. This is beyond reason here. It will come for them eventually. History proves it over and over again. Go ahead, George, because we're rapidly running out.
That's exactly right. And that's what happens when you start playing this very dangerous game. People who should know better think that, this will get us to power. Once we're in power, then we can just call off these mad dogs and we'll be nice and safe. No, it doesn't really work that way. As the old Bolsheviks found, having got rid of all of their enemies, the kulaks, the Tsarist bureaucracy, the entire sort of Tsarist establishment, they would be safe. No, it came after them, and then it was the old Bolsheviks who was swept aside. That's exactly what will happen here. And what is it? It's all really this very, very narrow goal of seizing power. They seize power. They believe that it is their legitimate, their right for this power. Overthrow Trump, and they will be there. And it never works that way.
Dima, one of the interesting things for me, I mean, we talk a lot about ideology, and you're the best at it here. But particularly in the West in general, but particularly in the United States, there's a huge economic turndown. This is adding on to this because you have these elements that use this ideology for political reasons, but they inadvertently are flaming the economic and financial discontent of people. So you're going to get this this mixture. This is going to be a very interesting a brew here because people are half the country's poor. I mean, nobody wants to admit it in media. Half the country is poor, and now we have like Black Lives Matter. We have this intentional delegitimizing tradition, law, rule of law, and that's why I wanted to talk about this article. Last 15 seconds, go to you, Dima. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm going to commit another iconoclasm here. You know, we will be dismissed by liberal media for comparing the United States now to Russia of 1917. Just one more for you guys to get angry. Czeslaw Miłosz, you know, loved by the liberals, a Polish historian and writer. He wrote why Bolsheviks won also in Poland in the late 40s. He said that they filled the void, you know. What BLM and others are doing in the United States, they're creating the void. They destroy religion, they destroy history.
There's a whole lot more to talk about on another episode of CrossTalk. I want to thank my guests in Moscow and in Budapest, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here on RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.